My name is Luke Eastwood, and I'm going to talk to you today about trees. So I've got quite a lot of stuff. Gosh, it's one of those subjects you could spend a whole day talking about it, and you still wouldn't be done. But I'm going to try and condense some of the stuff about the spiritual, practical elements of trees and their usages as well into 45 minutes. So anyway, it's something I've covered in my books in various different ways. The first one is this little book called The Journey. There's a story in it called The Garden, which references the Tree of Life and the Tree of Knowledge. It's sort of a retelling of the biblical story, which you're probably all familiar with in Genesis. A slightly different take on that. And then another book, Pruning books, is this one, called The Druid's Primer. There's quite a lot about trees in that one, particularly about tree lore and about Ohm. There's quite a lot on that in that book, amongst various other things. And the last one I've done with Moon Books, which is new, just out, is the Druid Garden. So that one goes into a lot more detail about trees. There's a much larger number of trees, because as you probably know, Ohm has only got 25 letters in total, so that limits you to a maximum of 25 trees. Whereas I've gone into a lot more detail into all the trees from across Europe. So anyway, that's enough about my books. So yeah, trees. We all know how important trees are. Basically, the trees and the plankton are what keep us alive. Without them, there wouldn't be sufficient oxygen for us to breathe. So they are incredibly important, and trees, much more than sort of shrubs and herbaceous plants or grasses, they produce masses and masses of oxygen. So a mature tree can actually produce a huge quantity of clean air in particularly in cities. Certain trees like hornbeams are really valuable for that, because they're very tolerant to pollution, and London plane as well. So yeah, they've been around obviously since the beginning of time, and they have very, very important symbolism for people, for humanity, and you'll find it all over the world. You know, the Tree of Life really is a universal symbol. So you'll find it in Ireland with the Bíle, which is sort of is a totemic tree, the Celtic world tree, you might want to call it. You know, the Latin name was Axis Mundi, which you know, the Romans used, and Yggdrasil is the Norse name. And you'll also find the sacred tree, the Bodhi tree, in Buddhism, which Gautama Siddhartha is said to have sat under while he waited to receive enlightenment. And you'll of course find it in Kabbalah, which is from Judaism. The Tree of Life is Etz Chaim, I think is the right pronunciation, I hope. And also in Egypt, Ished. And all these seem to go back really right back to Sumerian culture, which is the earliest recorded instances we have of a sort of holy or symbolic tree. So they're obviously very important. People have always known how vital and important trees are anyway, so it makes sense that they would crop up in people's religions all over the world. And so I'll come back to some of the spiritual elements of trees a bit later with some specific examples, but for now I'm just going to talk about some of the practical elements of trees, because in my experience, a lot of people have an interest in trees. They like trees, but they don't necessarily have a deep understanding of how trees work and how best to look after them, which obviously if you want to nurture the natural environment, you want to nurture trees, it does help if you know something about them. And as some of you may know, I'm a Druid, but I'm also a horticulturist. I trained in the School of Horticulture in Dublin, and I did a couple of exams through the Royal Horticultural Society as well. And I've built up some practical experience from working in garden centres and maintaining large estates, and also from doing private jobs, gardens for people. So those different areas of experience really do kind of help you to understand the plants better. And although I have to say, I've seen people working in horticulture who don't have a very spiritual attitude, who are quite happy to just go and rip everything out, get out the glyphosate and spray it everywhere. I think the fact that I have a spiritual perspective coming from Druidry actually really helps in my connection with plants and with nature. So, I would hope that I use my horticultural knowledge in a positive way, in a good way that's benefiting the planet, not one of just going and raping and pillaging the garden, which unfortunately some people are quite happy to do that. It's a paid gig. Somebody says, "Oh, rip out all those trees," they'll just do it without thinking about it, which is something I probably might refuse to do, actually. I really am not keen on doing such things, although sometimes it is actually necessary in order to actually move forward and improve a place. You might have to take a few trees out in certain circumstances. So anyway, moving on about actual trees. I think it's important to get to know the parts of a tree, which means really learning a little bit about anatomy. You don't really have to go into it in depth, pardon me, sorry. But it helps to know something about the different parts of a tree. I mean, some are obvious. Everyone knows that they've got leaves. Everybody knows that they've got roots and a trunk and branches. But there's quite a lot more to it than that. For instance, trees actually do breathe. They breathe in the opposite way to us. They actually want carbon dioxide and they expel oxygen. They do pull up oxygen as well through the root system mostly. But what they do mostly is exhale oxygen, and they capture carbon dioxide out of the air. And one of the ways that they do this is through these tiny holes, which are called stomata, which you'll find mostly on the leaves, but you also find them on the bark to some extent. So, I mean, if you want to look into this a bit more, I'm not going to go into this in detail in a short video like this, but you can find a lot of information about the different parts of a tree and what they actually do on the internet. And of course, trees, like other animals and humans, they have a sex life. It sounds a bit weird for a tree to have a sex life, doesn't it? But quite often you've got male and female, and you also have hermaphrodite trees, but they have to reproduce. And there's various ways that they go about doing that, usually through flowers, and most of them have pollinators, or in some cases the wind may be of some use, but just like many other plants, they tend to rely on insects and birds for pollination, and also to some extent for spreading their seed. So that's quite an interesting area to look into, I think. So actually, when it comes to you've got trees in your garden or somewhere where you frequent, observation is a really powerful thing. I know that sounds like an obvious thing to say, but quite often, you know, I'd see people walking around and they go to the park or they go to the woods and they've got the phone in one hand, and quite often you see them walking very, very quickly. They're out doing a sort of almost a jog, and it appears to me at least that they're not actually taking anything in. They go out for the walk in nature, but they're passing through nature at great speed rather than actually being present in it. And what I mean by observation is actually being present. So you're not just there, but you're with the tree and you look at it properly. And a lot of problems that occur in plants, you can spot through observation, for actually carefully looking at them, which is quite an important thing because, like anything else, health is something that needs to be monitored. People that have children will obviously understand this, that you know, you look at your children every day, and being concerned about them, you quickly notice if they've cut themselves or they've got a massive bruise or whatever they've done, and you step in and intervene and look after them. And that's normal parenting, to try to maintain their health. And in a similar way, we can be custodians of trees if we take the time to actually go and look at them and see what's happening with them. Obviously, part of that is actually understanding what you're seeing. So, you know, that's again where the anatomy comes in, where if you have a little bit more knowledge about the plant and its different parts, that helps you to understand what you're actually seeing. So, and also another aspect of this is sensing and feeling. I mean, people will sometimes poo-poo this and laugh at it, like, you know, Prince Charles was laughed at for talking to plants. But I don't think that's such a daft idea. And anybody who's obviously got an interest in the magical, the esoteric, would realize that these are living beings and they are sentient to some extent. Scientific experiments have actually proven this, that they do have rudimentary awareness. Trees don't have a brain, but they do have a rudimentary nervous system as such. And they can communicate with each other. And in a very basic way, they can communicate with us too, if we're open to that interaction, to receiving. Obviously, they can't speak to us, but on a sort of very, very subtle level, really mostly through, I suppose, a form of journeying, really, or sort of entering to a subconscious state. That's how you communicate with them. So, you know, just like a person that's sick, maybe might not be able to actually say, hey, I'm sick, I'm ill. They might be too unwell to communicate to you that they're sick, but you can see that they're unwell, and you can sort of pick up, you know, from their aura, from their general demeanor, and all your senses that somebody's not well. The same thing is true with a tree. You might be able to pick up and sense what's wrong with it, that it's sick, that it needs help. And that's again something where horticultural knowledge can come in very handy. And if your awareness of firstly something being unwell, and then being able to figure out how are you going to help it, how are you going to fix it. So something to watch out for, particularly, I've noticed over time, is unfortunately animal pests that will do damage to trees, and sometimes quite devastatingly and even fatal. Rabbits would be a very serious problem, and also hares. they like to chew the bark, and that will certainly slow down their growth, and it will also provide an entry point for diseases. And in, unfortunately, in severe cases, it'll kill the tree as well. I've also seen that with horses and donkeys. You know, actually, when I was a kid, a friend of mine gave me a beautiful birch tree which we planted, and the field next door had a white horse in it. Anyway, anytime I went down there, the horse was sort of nowhere near the tree, or on the other side of the field. But we noticed that all the leaves on one side of the tree were gone. And of course, eventually we copped it. It was the horse, but he was pretty clever, this horse. He always stayed away whenever anyone came near. So we never saw him actually do it, but it was quite obvious that the horse was eating all the new leaves. So it was a bit of a bit of variety to the horse's diet instead of just the grass. So eventually, what my father did was put a load of chicken wire around the fence to prevent the horse from reaching over and eating one side of the tree. And I've also seen donkeys eating bark actually off of trees, which, I mean, can do immense damage. One particular place I went to, there must have been about a dozen trees that this donkey had a go at and caused an awful lot of damage to the bark. So, and what happens is when they ring the tree, when the bark is eaten away in a sort of constant ring all the way round, then above that level, everything dies. Because really it's the outer layer of the tree that is what you call alive. The inner sort of heartwood is not actually alive, it's dead tissue. That's just provides strength and structure to the tree. It doesn't actually have any real proper function as such. Actually, I wouldn't call it dead exactly, but it's sort of non-functional would be a better description. So obviously, if that happens, and your rabbits or horse or a donkey have done that, all that growth is then eliminated from that point upwards. So that's something you want to avoid if possible, and that can be done with collars, plastic or material collars, or chicken wire, something like that. Because you can have massive casualties if you're in an area that, say, for instance, got loads of rabbits in or lots of hares. Then they're not going to think about the tree. They're just going to do what they do. So you have to step in to prevent that from happening. I mean, this is another problem that can happen with strimming. Strimming is quite a good idea because lots of long grass and weeds around the trunk can cause some damage, cause rotting and a lot of dampness. So it's a good idea actually to do a bit of strimming, but you need to do it very carefully, because I've seen this happen a lot where people with strimmers come along and especially with young trees, the plastic on the strimmer whips around the bark and just takes off all of it in a circle, and then your tree's done. That's it. It's had it at that point. It only takes 2 seconds to kill a tree with a strimmer. So you need to be very, very careful with those. So, sorry, you have to forgive me. I have got a little bit of a cough at the moment, so I'll have to stop and have water every now and then. So another important area with trees, which some people have difficulties pruning. So the basic rules of pruning is the 3 Ds, which is dead, diseased, and damaged. Remember those the 3 Ds. So as a general thing, you want to avoid branches crossing over and rubbing against each other, because that's an entry point for disease. Where the bark's rubbed off, it's very easy for fungal and bacterial infections to get in. The bark is sort of like skin. Skin does an awful lot to protect animals and humans. You know, everyone knows that if you have a nasty cut and it gets dirty, you can get an infection. The same applies with trees. If their bark has been penetrated, it's a lot easier for infections to get in. So early spring or late autumn is generally, I think, the best time to do pruning. You don't really want to do pruning during the maximum growth, and you don't want to cut away things like flowers and fruit, because obviously, say you've got an apple tree and you cut off the branches that have got flowers on that, that is your fruit where the flowers are. So if you try and prune then, you've just got rid of all of your apples. So that's really not a good idea at all. I suggest looking into this a bit more carefully, because there's different types of apple trees and fruit trees. That there's more specifics, which I won't go into because that would take too long. But you'll find videos and information on the internet about all this stuff. That's the wonderful thing about today. You don't really even need to buy books these days. You can, if you know what you want to find out about specifically, you can go and find it quite easy. You'll find good instructional videos on everything. So one exception I find, what I was saying about pruning and avoiding the summer, is the cherry tree, especially where I live in Ireland. So that rule would apply to anywhere that's a particularly damp climate. So if you're in, say, in Scotland or Wales or the Manchester area of England, which is west part of the UK, or parts of Canada and North America, even some parts of Asia as well. I think there's a part of New Zealand as well that's got the highest rainfall in the whole world. If you live in one of those regions, it can be quite difficult growing cherry trees, because they tend to like fairly dry weather, and they're one of these trees that's quite prone to diseases. Bacterial canker is a particularly bad one, which affects lots of cherries. You may have seen this sort of kind of syrupy kind of resin that's sort of running down the bark, and lesions on the bark, and that's caused by bacterial canker. And that often gets in when people have pruned cherry trees during damp weather. So that is an exception. Obviously, you want to avoid cutting off the fruit. So, I mean, most of the cherry trees I come across, they will be in sort of midsummer that you get fruit, through to possibly early autumn. So at that point, that would be the time to prune it, when you've just taken off the fruit. And prune it during good hot weather. If you've got a nice dry spell that lasts for a week or so, that would be ideal, because the last thing you want is your lovely cherry tree to suddenly develop a fungal infection or bacterial infection, and then it's sickly from that point onwards, and then it's going to produce less fruit and just generally be in poor health from that point. So that's the one real exception, is the cherry tree. You want to be very careful with them. Like I said, yeah, diseases is something I mentioned earlier on, observation and sensing what's going on with the tree. So the bark is affected, as I mentioned before, canker. That's a really serious problem. And you can also get problems with the fungi. Bracket fungus, for instance, is something that can do a lot of damage, and it gets right inside the tree. But you'll see the fungus sort of on the outside. You'll see what's basically the reproductive parts of the fungus, which produce the spores. That's what you will actually see on a tree. But what happens is it gets under the bark and spreads all through the tree. And quite often a tree might end up being hollowed out over time. You know, I've seen big beech trees and oak trees where that's happened, and it looks fine from the exterior. You can just see this bit of bracket fungus, for instance, sticking out. But what's happened is the tree is getting weaker and weaker, and you don't tend to realize until suddenly the tree just tips over because the trunk has been rotted away by the fungus. So it can be actually quite a dangerous thing. You know, if there's a storm or anything like that, they become very weakened by the fungal infection, and you might think, oh, I'll stand on this tree, you know, shelter from the rain, but you could actually be standing next to a tree that's about to fall over any minute because the trunk's been so badly damaged. But of course you can't see that because the bark is covering all of that damage. Another thing, leaves. That's something that's you get a lot of diseases that affect that. You'll see that a lot in fruit trees, like peach leaf curl affects not just peaches, lots of fruit trees. And you'll see viral infections. Quite often you'll see discoloration and veins on the leaves. Again, if you can buy a couple of books that will cover all this stuff. They actually show pictures, or again, you can look on the internet. It's not a bad idea to become familiar with some of the diseases that affect trees. One particularly bad one to watch out for is fire blight, because there is absolutely no cure for fire blight. All you can do is chop off the infected areas and hope it doesn't spread any further. But if you're unlucky, you've got no choice but to dig the tree up and chop it down, and then you have to burn it. Really, you can't put anything with fire blight anywhere near compost. The best thing to do is burn all the infected material to prevent it spreading. It's really unfortunate when you get a large bush or a tree infected with that, but it really is. It's pretty much a fatal disease for trees, sadly. Okay, so before I move on to some more spiritual stuff again, a few more things to cover. An important aspect of looking after trees is planting them. And there's several options about that. The cheapest option, which is probably my favorite, is bare root, what you call bare root trees, where you buy them from a garden centre. They've been grown in mostly gravel, so they're easily removed. So you have literally a bare root system at the bottom of the trunk. You see the sort of fibrous roots, and they're really cheap to buy. The only problem with that is they're only available for a short period of time, which is generally speaking from November through to March. It did used to be a bit earlier, I found. In October, it would often be cold enough that the trees had already lost their leaves and sort of become dormant. But that seems to have got later now. So really, you'd be into November. I suppose because of global warming, the period when the trees are dormant is actually shorter than it used to be, because the weather doesn't tend to get colder till later on. Okay, so bare root stuff, you have to plant it quickly. If you go and you buy it from a garden centre, there's no point leaving it in the shed for 3 weeks. Ideally, you will take it home and plant it the same day or the following day. And whatever you do, don't leave bare root trees lying out in the sun. They should be kept in a bag with some water and in the shade until they're planted. You know, never ever leave the tree with its roots exposed in the sun, because you're just asking for trouble if you do that. Now, the other options, a root ball, a sort of a bag, that's sort of often the bigger stuff, very similar to bare root, and pots. The most expensive is generally pot-grown trees. And They can be planted anytime, really, from autumn through to late spring, really. I mean, you can get away with May. And so from now on, June, July, August, probably not the best times for planting because we get the very hot weather. I mean, you might chance it if, like here where I live, the weather is very changeable. It's often raining. We don't tend to get very hot summers. You could probably get away with planting a tree at this time of year now. But what's really important with all of these trees, whether they're bare root or root ball or in a pot, is to water them in. You know, I mean, if you really care about trees, you may plant them with a specific purpose, with a spiritual purpose. You might choose to do a blessing. It might be for a grove, or for it could be for a baby naming or something. People sometimes have given a tree as a present. You want to make sure it survives, because if it's got significance on a spiritual level as well, it's all the more devastating if you lose your tree than if it was just like a random tree that you happen to plant. So watering plants in is really, really important. So for the first couple of weeks, you want to be keeping an eye on them for water, and then thereafter, if you come into a drought period, you need to give them some more water as well, because it takes a while for the roots to get established. It's funny, really, when you think about humans, when we move house, you know, we take a while to bed in, to get used to our new environment. And it's the same with a tree. It's different, obviously, but you know, they don't acclimatize overnight. They need time for the roots to start to grow, to get more established. And it's a shock to the system any time that a plant is moved. So they do need extra care when that happens. And another very important point is compacting the soil. Most of the oxygen they get through the roots. Okay, so if you're there stamping away on the ground with your boots, squashing all the oxygen, the air out of the soil, it's going to have a very bad effect on your tree that you've just planted. So firm stuff in gently with your feet. Don't be hopping up and down like Rumpelstiltskin next to your tree you've just put in. And don't put big piles of rubbish or bricks or whatever on your tree. So some people like to stake. I prefer not to if I can avoid it. Sometimes in a very windy spot, you've no choice. You've got to put stakes in. When you bear in mind, in nature, trees don't come with a stake. So the best way is to start small. The smaller the tree is, a little one that's like that big will not suffer too much for the wind. And as it grows, it will get stronger roots and it'll be wind resistant. Obviously, something's a bit bigger that's a meter or more high, you might need a stake possibly. Okay, and planting at the correct distance is important. You've got to bear in mind what's going to happen with your tree. You know, some trees don't get very big. For instance, rowan doesn't tend to get massive. If you plant like a giant redwood or a sessile oak, something like that, it's going to be massive, absolutely huge in time. Obviously, long after you're dead, it'll reach its full height. But so you know, you're bearing in mind what you're planting. You've got to leave, say, 3 meters or 5 meters or even 10 meters between trees. If you say that they're going to be massive, you want to leave a decent size. Unless, say, you're doing hedging, then those rules don't really apply. So, and also, the thing I've often seen people do wrong is planting trees at the wrong depth. If you plant them too high, then the roots stick out of the ground, which I've seen that, particularly with a line of beech trees I once saw, where the roots were just too far out the ground, big gnarly roots sticking out, because they were originally planted too high. And planting too deep is also bad. So you couldn't see a little line, a dividing line at the bottom of the bark where the roots start. It's not always very easy to see. On some trees it is, but it's definitely there. And perhaps if you've got a bit of, if it's dirty, you might want to get a little bit of water or a soft cloth and wipe off the base of the trunk so you can see where that line is. If you're unsure, if you're not familiar with doing this, that might be helpful, so you don't end up planting the tree at the wrong height. Okay, so another thing to think about is where you're going to do this. The right tree for the right conditions, like for instance boggy ground, willows, elm, alder trees, they all love the wet, they love the damp. So if you've got a bog and you want to soak up a bit of water, those kind of trees will be very beneficial. And like you think about, if you've got really dry sandy conditions, something like a holm oak, which is an evergreen oak, they'll survive in the south of France in like baking hot conditions. Pines, olive trees, stuff like that will do well by the sea, and they'll do well in drought conditions. So, you know, if you live in an area that's like that, you need to pick those kind of trees. If you live by the sea, you have to again be careful. Pine trees, buckthorn, hawthorns, they'll do fairly well. To some extent, oak and ash will do reasonably. Quite often it's a good idea to have a screen of very resistant trees like sycamore that can take loads of salt, and like the more delicate trees behind them away from the salt wind a bit. So you really need to think about what you're doing, because you know, if you try to create something special in the garden, especially if it's for spiritual purposes, it's heartbreaking if you, a year or two later, all your trees have snuffed it and you have to start again. So it's really important that you, well, one is having the right intention and putting your energy into it. They will benefit from that, from your own energy and blessings and all that kind of thing. But they'll also benefit massively from the right horticultural techniques, the right knowledge, and doing things properly at the beginning. So, because I mean, these trees will, many of them will outlive you by hundreds of years even. And it's nice to think that there's kind of a legacy that you've left for the future, for the earth, especially at these times when we're all very much aware of the negative effects of humanity on the environment and how we are suffering as well as the earth because of the stupidity of humanity over millennia. So, I mean, if you want to make a difference, planting a tree will be something you can do that is a real practical, concrete thing. But you want to make sure that that effort you put in is going to pay off, that this tree will survive and live a long life, long after you've gone, hopefully. So anyway, from that, I'm going to move back into the spiritual ideas as I'm kind of bringing in to get to the end. The spiritual aspect, symbolism again. Trees are very much a sort of symbol of renewal, the renewal of life. And so generally, they're a symbol of protection and strength in general. I've seen some really amazing images of, I can't remember what kind of tree, some kind of African tree, all on its own, in a sort of savanna scrub area. And then you see, it was speeded up, this video, and it showed different animals coming and sheltering underneath it from the sun. And, you know, that was a very powerful image of the tree as a form of protection and nurturing. So I'm going to look at two examples specifically now, which are the birch and the oak, which are quite different in their properties. The birch is actually my favorite tree. So the birch tree, it's so very much symbolic of beginnings. It's very much associated with purity and protection as well, and also with rebirth, among other trees. Yew would be something associated with death and rebirth, but its qualities are really very different. It's generally regarded as a feminine tree, and it's often associated with the goddess Pruning. Excuse me, sorry about that. You'll also find associations with Angus MacAnog, the Irish god of love, and Dermot and Grania, and the actual theme of love, romantic love, is connected with the birch tree too. It's also supposed to offer a level of protection against malevolent fairies. It's generally quite a benign tree, but strangely, it's also been used to punish children in the past. With birching in Scotland, which was banned, I think back when I was a kid. I was born in Scotland, but I didn't actually go to school there, so I never got birched. But yeah, that's quite an outlandish and archaic, quite horrific thing. But yeah, birch was used for brooms as well, so it was used for beating kids, unfortunately, as well. Now, it's got lots of uses. Some of them are sort of like related to oils and tars, pitch and tar, and making ropes as well is another common thing. So for twisted bark. Bark is used for starting fires as well. There's tannin, and there's actually a syrup which is sort of similar in nature to maple syrup, but you can't actually take as much of it as you would from a sugar maple. So you'd be quite careful if you're taking the syrup making syrup from birch trees. Don't take too much because you'll kill the tree if you do. It's also got lots of medicinal uses. It's anti-inflammatory. It's good for the skin. It helps prevent fevers. It's antibacterial properties as well. Along with pine is probably more famous for that. But yeah, it's certainly got a lot of many uses. And birch tree, from a practical point of view, it's got quite shallow roots. They don't like really drought conditions because of the shallowness of the roots. They do tend to do quite well at high altitudes, particularly the Himalayan birch. It's kind of a medium height tree. It's not gigantic. And they generally live maybe around 100 years. You've got a few varieties that live maybe 300, but most of them won't get to be over 100 years. So yeah, pretty much close to the limits of a human lifetime. Okay, so the oak tree, I'll move on to that now. I mean, this is probably the most famous tree in association with the Druids. It's very much connected with sovereignty, with strength, and also fertility. And there's about 600 different varieties of oak around the world, which is a massive number. It was sacred, obviously, to the Celts and also to the Norse. Yggdrasil, the Norse world tree, is sometimes regarded as an oak. Other people might regard it as an ash tree. So it's not really very clear which tree it is. It's also, the oak's associated with Don, which is sort of an underworld aspect of the Dagda, and also the god Taranis. And you also might find association with Thor and with Zeus too, so it's quite widespread. And I mentioned the Dagda. The Dagda is the kind of more common aspect, not Don, and he had an oak harp. So you see a connection there as well. It's got so many uses. It was really popular in shipping. It used to be used a lot in construction. You find a lot of medieval houses are made with oak. Furniture, very popular in furniture. Oh, and it makes amazing quality charcoal. Tar, the acorns as well, food both for animals and even humans. I mean, during World War II, people used to make a substitute for coffee out of acorns, because obviously coffee was very difficult to get in Europe at that time. It's got loads of medicinal uses, anti-inflammatory, antiseptic. It even helps with impotence, apparently, and fever. And the bark flowers for oak remedy is used for sort of depression and despair. So quite wide-ranging, very different from the birch. And again, the oak, it's got much deeper roots, and they'll grow almost anywhere. they do tend quite often reach a massive height, particularly the Irish oak, the sessile oak, which can live for about 1,000 years. So yeah, much longer life, much bigger. And I suppose that's why sometimes it's referred to, you know, as the king of the trees by some. So anyway, that's just two examples. Obviously, every single tree has got its own folklore, its own medicinal, practical uses, and the spiritual aspects to it as well. So hopefully that's giving you a bit of an overview of the different aspects of trees. So I mean, a lot of that's covered in my latest book, but you also find it covered in all kinds of horticultural books and various other spiritual books. Books on home, for instance, will cover some of those trees, and you'll find a wealth of information about it all on the internet. So if that's been interesting, go away and have a look and put a little bit of time in, and hopefully that extra knowledge will be helpful to you when you have trees and you're planting them, you're looking after them, and creating a sort of ongoing relationship with trees and nature in general. So thank you very much for listening, and I hope that's been interesting for you. And yeah, good luck with your gardening. Bye-bye.